For me, it's just been a natural thing. The hardest part has been teaching that. And so it comes very, very intuitive. And I've tried to teach it a lot of different ways. What I found is teaching somebody without a science background, a scientific method doesn't work. And so they like zone out, like, oh, God, it's science. But if you talk about design thinking really resonates. And guess what? Design thinking is the scientific method. It's just displayed a different way. And so what you find is like the way the business frameworks are often built are off of the scientific method. And it's just, it's named something else.
Hey, everybody. My name's Ryan Atkinson, and you are on the Business Cloud. I'm excited to welcome Jamie Fitch, the co-founder and CEO of OnlineMedEd, to the podcast to talk about their mission to change how medical education is approached, how medical schools deliver it, and how students learn it. I absolutely love that mission statement. I'm excited to welcome Jamie to the podcast. Jamie, thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having me, Ryan.
I want to start off in your early days. Looking at your background, you graduated from Ohio State with a degree in molecular genetics, and then you got your master's from Tulane in public health and epidemiology. Horrible pronouncing names or words. I want to ask, did you ever think in those moments when you were studying genetics, when you were studying medicine, that you would soon be the co-founder and CEO of a company with over 60 employees, and you've now raised over $20 million?
Ryan, I can tell you're not a scientist. And
definitely not.
No, so I started as a scientist. I wanted to help cure cancer like everybody else, or whatever it might be, right? I had this desire, this intrinsic value that drove me. And when I got started, I was going to be a scientist and I was going to be a physician. And that was what you do when you go into science. Science is not a place there's a lot of innovation, but it's not a place that usually breeds entrepreneurship, or at least not when I was there back in the early aughts of the 2000s. So I really had no idea until I got further along. And so when I was in school, actually doing my work in epidemiology, I started to see where my future might go. And so I went to Tulane in New Orleans in response to Hurricane Katrina. Oh, wow. Really to help rebuild the healthcare system from the ground up. What an opportunity, right? But when I got there, things were worse than I could have imagined. So much so that I didn't have teachers for a lot of my coursework. So I would show up to immunology and microbiology, and the city was underwater for 90 days without power. And so a lot of the professors, they just left rather than rebuild, never to return. What? So I paid Tulane $60,000 a year to teach myself. I did. We were scrappy, taught ourselves, taught the people around us. And my partner and I, we looked at each other and said, this problem's not going away. There's always the unknown. There's always something around the corner that we have to be prepared for. So actually, the entrepreneurship did start while I was a student, really out of need. If I didn't do that, I wouldn't have been able to graduate, get the degree, support the people around me, and just kind of caught the bug. And so eventually went and moved to Austin and started as a clinical epidemiologist working in the hospital, but that bug never really left. And being in a city like Austin, it really helped grow it, as a matter of fact. And eventually I made the jump, and I jumped in and I started the company in 2014, and it's been a fun ride ever since.
Nice. So we're in 2014, we're in 2022 now. That's incredible. Can you tell us a little bit more about like OnlineMedEd? I think just going from it, it's so intuitive from your website. It's a well-built website. Can you tell us, I mean, you identified this problem, but can you tell us about the early days of OnlineMedEd and really getting this thing off the ground?
Sure. So we started it like everyone starts when they don't know what they're doing. I read some articles online and said, write a business plan. So my partner and I, we got together and we started writing a business plan. But the difference in us is we only made it to about page 5, and then we stopped. So we had a pretty good idea of what we need to do. Let's get to work. Now, what's interesting is if you do look at that 5-page business plan that was incomplete from 2014, it's the exact same that we have today. Wow. So we didn't really have to pivot too much. We always had this idea that we wanted to elevate healthcare education to create better providers. And to do that, we had to start somewhere. So we started in medical education in medical school, but we knew that we needed to do that to make enough revenue to then do the next thing. Make enough revenue, then do the next thing. We always wanted to focus on healthcare at large. And so really what we built this foundational idea of how do we elevate the education? And elevating education includes the education itself. It includes training of the faculty. It includes technology to deliver it and best practices. And it's really trying to think of that from an ecosystem perspective that has gotten us to where we are. And we started very small, as everybody does, in like a single year of a single curriculum. And then what we've done is continued to add to that. And so our sphere of influence continues to grow every day, but it's still at its core, we're solving the same business problem, but we're really good at identifying what that is. And it doesn't mean that it doesn't mean that when you have something solved and you've identified a problem that it can't evolve over time, but like that core ethos of what we're trying to do has remained the same.
Interesting. That's I was reading a book called Amazon Unbound by Brad Stone recently, and they talked about Jeff Bezos's like planning process. They said at Amazon, it's more shoot, then aim, instead of usually like aim, then shoot. It sounds like it was pretty familiar or pretty common, or not common, but sounds similar to what you did. Is okay, we got this 5-page business plan. We know what we want to do, and then it's just go execute.
Yeah, but everything changes over time. So going to Bezos, early on, all he wanted to do was be the best bookstore on the planet.
Yeah.
And for the first like 10, 15 years, that's literally all they did. So we know Amazon is this sprawling enterprise now, but that's relatively new, right? That's like the second half or the third of their journey to this point. And so they were ruthlessly focused on being the best bookstore on the planet for over a decade to really establish themselves. And then they started adding to it. So I think, that's a great approach. I think the focus component is what's key there. And so you talk about shoot and then focus. Well, that's what they can do now because they've achieved so much revenue and they have such strong market penetration and they're looking for new things that are exciting that will direct them. But they sure as heck didn't get that way.
Yeah. From a CEO perspective, you're CEO, co-founder of OnlineMed. What are some of the things that you're focusing on now from a day-to-day perspective, from a year, 3 years, 5 years, and how does that change over time as markets change, as you learn? How does your vision change and the focus?
Yeah, that's a great question, Ryan. So vision often stays pretty much the same. So you're thinking there's books like Scaling Up that will say, the big, hairy, audacious goal. You set this out way in the future. This is what we're trying to achieve. And so that one pretty much is your North Star. That one stays. And what changes, of course, is what happens day to day, week to week, month to month, et cetera. And so I like to think in terms of horizons. So horizon 1 is the next 90 days. So what are you trying to accomplish this quarter? Horizon 2 is then 90 to 365. Horizon 3 is 365 to 3 years. And then everything's ultimately working towards that big goal down the line. Now, once you start looking at horizons, the next thing I do then is set work streams. And so you have a work stream. In my business, I have a B2C work stream. So directly what we're doing with students on the marketing side, a B2B, what we're doing with the institutions. We have things like conferences. We always have fundraising. We have technology. And essentially what we just try to do is align these work streams and make sure that we have goals, Horizon 1, Horizon 2, Horizon 3 for each one of those. And when we have those, they're not set in stone, right? So maybe your next 90 days are, but the rest is we'll wait and see. And so to wait and see what you need to have a data infrastructure. So you need to be able to see what's happening with your students, with your users. So you need to be talking to your users. You need to be in the market. And then that's also key. You need to really know what's going on with your market, not just you or your competitors, but at large. And so you need to understand the research. You need to understand the behaviors that are changing. And sometimes it's not even your market. You just have to understand the macro picture, what's happening. Yeah. So we're living right now through interesting times with inflation and looming recession, and there's a startup winter, so it's very hard to raise money right now. And so those big shifts you have to be aware of because you literally have to change how you run your business because of that. And even if you think, well, my business is not going to be impacted by these things, guess what? It is, because let's say you need money. There's people sitting in the cheap seats, but they have a lot of power because they're the ones that have the money. So they see what's happening at the macro level, and you can say, I'm not going to be impacted because maybe I'm in higher ed, and when there's a recession, people actually go back to school. So we should be in a good place. It just doesn't work that way though, because they're saying, yeah, but everybody's impacted and we're very risk adverse right now. So we need you to just take that in mind in the decisions that you're making.
Interesting. What are some of the challenges can you tell us about like the B2B aspect of what you're doing? Because I'm not too familiar about like selling into like the educational space or like into healthcare. I am a little bit more, but can you tell us like some of the unexpected challenges someone might not realize when selling into education institutions?
Sure. Yeah. Our business, is a hybrid model. And so we're working with learners and we're working with faculty and we're working with the institutions. And so we really believe to elevate healthcare education, the entire ecosystem, everybody's got to be involved. We have to be better together, right? And so if I focus solely on students, faculty are going to be neglected and they're not going to understand what the students are getting, and they're not going to feel that they're involved. If I just focus on the faculty, the students are going to, just check out. And then if I forget about the institution, they have unique problems that are inclusive of, but not exclusive to, those two user groups. And so they have things that they're trying to figure out, like clinical sites. How do we standardize clinical sites, and how do we recruit, maybe pipeline? How do we address that? And so you really have to think about it from that angle to really achieve what you're trying to do. So in healthcare, going back to the B2B side, the biggest thing that we focus on is faculty development. And so everybody knows that hybrid is in, and hybrid's not going away, but it doesn't mean that they're prepared for it.
Yep.
And so a lot of faculty are still spending 10 hours to make a 1-hour lecture, and they're still getting in front of the classroom and they're just delivering it. And that's not something they need to do. What we want to do is empower them to be great educators. So faculty development comes down to really that. And it's not necessarily tactical or technical skills, but it's helping them see the bigger picture. So to do that, we might do things around professional identity formation. What does it mean to be an educator right now? We might do things around coaching. So how do you be, an efficient coach and someone that your students want to turn to for help? It might be around building authentic curriculum. And so how do you get away from PowerPoints and really thinking about a cohesive system and bringing in all these different elements that we need to really deliver great education? So it can't just be knowledge, as an example. It also must have the application. It also has to be inclusive. It has to be diverse. It has to be equitable. Helping institutions understand these, helping faculty understand these things are where we spend a lot of our time B2B.
Interesting. I'm curious, what are your thoughts on the metaverse and specifically medical education in the metaverse? I had a great founder, Steve Grubbs, on the podcast. He is providing these metaverse universities, what he's calling them, where he's providing medical students that are able to get hands-on experience. I'm curious, you're in the space as well. What's your thoughts? Are you bullish on the metaverse when it regards to education in medical purposes?
Yeah, let's go with Web3. So what's the future of Web3 in education, particularly in healthcare education? I'm generally bullish on it. Of course, it is inevitable. We're going there. I don't know what the timeline is. The biggest blockers right now are simply technology.
Interesting.
And so computing power isn't where it needs to be yet to really be fully realized. And so it's a bit of a challenge. And so there is there are lots of startups doing really cool things with VR in terms of healthcare education. And I've seen them from the highest level down to the lowest. And so the highest level is Microsoft. Microsoft has Microsoft HoloLens. They have partnered with great schools like Case Western to create anatomy. So imagine a 3D heart. You walk into a room and your lecturer is walking around the heart and peeling off pieces of it. It's really cool. Is it really applicable right now? I don't know. So that's the gap right now. It's a really cool proof of concept, but I feel that it's a little bit too early to say, yes, this is where we're going. Now, where I am seeing the most use that really makes a lot of sense to me is in simulation with patient encounters. And so, I don't want my surgeon right now to learn how to suture through virtual reality, but certainly I want to put them in uncomfortable situations with patients that challenge their reasoning and their response. And so having a room that just has a patient, on a bed that allows you to ask them questions, and then they respond to, and then maybe they reach out and try to grab you, that kind of stuff is actually really valuable, because what you're not focused on the VR, you're actually focused on the conversation, but the VR is contributing to it in a positive way. Whereas if you do things like suturing, you're focused on the VR as the core. It's all right, we're going to teach you how to do this surgery. We're not there yet. But in terms of, having communications and teaching skills that you can then support with VR, I'm totally behind.
That's really interesting. That's where the anatomy point's a really good point, because I do think it's really cool where it's here's the heart, and I can peel back and I don't know all the parts of the heart, but you can see what's within the heart. But I do agree the hardware and the graphics wouldn't have a long way to go, but a simple application where you can just talk to a patient that's on the bed and challenge the thought process, the workflow that goes within your mind. I think that's a real usage case, and one that I actually have not thought about, but I am now bullish on as well.
It has a lot of utility. Imagine HR training that was in VR, that instead of just being something that you click through, it's an actual experience. Imagine management training, right? Where those types of questions are asked to you. And it's basically like a real-time choose your own adventure with a person in front of you. And is that person realistic? Not necessarily, but just by having that interaction, I think you can make the experience a lot better. And so that's what we really try to focus on in education. the pedagogy. So like, what am I doing? Am I doing this with intent? And then if your answer is not no, then if your answer is not yes, sorry, then stop. Don't continue going forward. You need to quit that. If you are, then it's okay. So what does intent mean? How do I use this resource to my best benefit? And that's where we try to focus in anything that we do. That's where a lot of the best companies, the ones that will make it, will also be spending their time.
Interesting. And I do want to talk about, that's really cool. I want to talk about like your frameworks that you have. I'm going to give you like some sort of problem, and I'm just curious how you would approach this. So let's just say, this is going off the top of my head, like someone in your C-suite comes to you and it's like, we don't know, like this market's going to work out. How is this going to work? We're seeing some sort of traction here, but we're not sure if this particular segment that maybe you're going to open up a new like psychology class, we just don't know if this is going to work. So with that, I mean, how do you approach problems when someone does come to you where it's like, okay, like I need to be on this? In short, yeah, how do you approach problems?
That's a good question. I've actually spent a lot of time. There's a lot of things that just come naturally that are intuitive. I've spent a lot of time trying to figure out, well, how do we teach this to other people?
Yeah.
So I can answer pretty well. I'll tell you in general, this is a common startup trope. So learn, build, measure, always in that mindset. So everything has these certain steps, but then obviously within each one, you have to be able to ask questions. And so on the learn side, you're trying to make decisions. There's a lot of things to consider. There's a lot of ways to learn. One, you can learn through users. And so you want to talk to them. Two, you can learn through experts. Three, you can learn through research. And so reading what's already out there. And then four, you have your own intuition. And so the key in any decision as you're trying to learn and really understand is to do all those things. And so I call it, it's like it's the quadrant, right? And you have to have each quadrant that you are approaching and trying to fill data in with. And so no one is going to get you there. And so as an example, I met a lot of people that tell me that they're data driven. That's dangerous. If you're only focused on data, you're driven by data, you're going to potentially get yourself into trouble because data is biased, just like everything else. Data is created by people and people have bias. So what I prefer to say is that you're data informed. And so where we focus is really going through those things. We'll talk to the users, we'll talk to experts, we'll look at the market, do market analyses, and then we'll use our own internal, like, what have we learned? Because our own experiences are certainly data points. They're valuable. And so we'll just jump in, we'll do the hard work. And the key to that though is figuring out, so what's the opportunity? So you want to try to get there as quickly as possible. And then based on that, how far do you want to go in your research? And so if you're like, this is going to make me $50,000 most likely, that you can't spend $200,000 of team time figuring that out. Like you have to put in basically kill criteria early on. It's like, all right, so as soon as we figure out, what's the first thing we want to figure out? Maybe it's market size. As soon as we figure out the market size isn't what we need it to be, we all agree we need to stop. Whatever we're at, we're going to write the note, and then we need to stick to that. And so like having those kill criteria are really important. So I guess taking a step back, I talked about those different things that we do. We do pre-planning exercises when we start. And so there's a book called Thinking in Bets by Annie Duke that has, it's a great book. It's a foundational book in decision science, and it has a couple different exercises that we employ on a regular basis. I don't think she created them, but she popularized them. And so pre-planning exercises, there's two in particular. There's a pre-mortem, and then there's backcasting. So these are things that you do before you start a project, where you start at the end, but then you work backwards. And the pre-mortem one is you assume failure, and then you try to identify as you go all the different failure points. And you say, at the end of the project, and if we did this, and we said it's going to take us 3 months to do this analysis, what would have to go wrong at the last second at 3 months for us to pull the plug? 1 month, 1 week, whatever it is, right? And this helps you identify those points that matter, those moments that matter, potential kill criteria or opportunities. Now, the opportunity side is backcasting. So you run it at the same time. One is assuming failure, backcasting is assuming success. So how do we find success ultimately? So at each moment, why would we continue going forward? What might happen? And you use these in conjunctions. It helps you in conjunction. It helps you see around the corner. It helps you start to identify where you might need to get lucky, or what things are going to tell you to stop. And both are important. Every decision there's two sides to the same coin, right? So there's persevere or there's quit. And you have to be very realistic and recognizing it's the same decision. And as a human species, we want to persevere always, but that's not the appropriate thing to do in business. It's just as important to quit and to know when it's not worth going forward. So you have to remove that bias that we naturally have ingrained, which is why we run exercises like that.
Interesting. So what's the line that you like straddle when you're someone going, oh, well, should we quit now or should we keep going with this? Because you always hear like, oh, consistency. How do you walk that line between, oh, we should quit or we should keep going here? Because there is some hunch here, but the results just haven't been there yet.
Yeah, it's tough. I think that line always changes based on appetite and based on how the business is doing. So, when you're building a business, you often have a financial partner. And so what's important is you say, hey, we're looking to do something new in our business. We're getting into psychology. We want you to be aware of it. And so transparency is really good. And we want you to be a partner in it. So we want you out in the market, just like we are. The collective intelligence of us will always, come out on top.
Yep.
So that's where I always start. And sometimes they'll say, hey, we think that's a stupid idea. You should stop. And generally speaking, you're like, all right, well, since you're the investors and want to keep you happy, maybe we'll pull back on that.
Yep.
But once you get into it, the model I always run with is a little data goes a long way. And so you don't need a lot to make a decision, right? Knowing a little bit is better than knowing nothing, but you don't need to know everything. And unfortunately, like the cost of knowledge increases around the margins. And it's the same with everything, right? So if you start marketing, say you turn on paid media, early on, you have great results because you've never done it before. But as you go, you're like, I need to extend now. Like I want to add another 10,000, 50,000, whatever it is. The margins, the customers that you're finding aren't your best customers anymore because you've already gotten them. So like your value goes down over time. It's the same with data. So the initial data that you find is probably the most valuable. So a little bit goes a long way. But as you continue, you're like, I'm trying to get precise. I want to go from understanding to like knowing. That becomes very expensive. And so you really have to ask, is that worth it? And so for us, we always say, a little goes a long ways. Let's make sure that we're getting some data. And data, by the way, again, I reference data as multiple things, remember. Yeah. So data is including talking to your customers, it's doing the research, it's actually looking at what's happening. It's your expertise, talking to experts, et cetera. But a little data goes a long way. So you always start there, and then you see based on that where you need to go. And again, I think especially running a business, it's the collective power of the group is just bringing in more ideas and more thoughts and getting more opinions to make sure that any one person isn't driving the conversation, or maybe is leading the conversation, but isn't driving the decision.
Interesting. And so when you are having like these brainstorming ideas where you're having a lot of people come in, like we're throwing ideas left and right, how do you weigh like the value of each decision? Is it that data point where it's like, oh, well, what's the data that you have behind this idea? Or how do you, as the leader of the company, weigh those decisions on what should be actually implemented?
That's a good question. I try to be a facilitator, right? And so you try to empower people to go get the information. But the key is kind of set frameworks up. And so for any investment you're going to make, do some financial modeling. It doesn't have to be perfect, but at least show me that you've done the financial modeling and that you can explain it. And the modeling is both on expenses, so OpEx, and then on the opportunity to make revenue. And then just punch holes in it, right? And so we can probably get pretty close on expenses. Expenses are relatively easy to evaluate because like, well, we're either we aren't going to spend the money or we aren't going to spend the time. The opportunity is usually where there's a lot of the guesswork, if you will. So that's just challenge. All right, so how confident are we? And then just basically asking people to put percentages to it. Be like, I think this is going to work. So, well, tell me, do you think it's going to work 50% of the time, 25% of the time? Like if you were to make a bet, what percentage would you put on it? And just that helps calibrate people and helps get them looking at it, objectively. And so going back to the question, it's just having a framework and like making sure that everybody knows, hey, there has to be financial modeling on it. And we're going to ask you these type of questions. And from a research perspective, we've expected you to do this much. We've expected you to talk to this many customers. Tell me why you reached out to these experts. What did you learn from them? It's just making sure that there's a consistent approach to it. It doesn't mean that it's like a required, like this must be done every time. As soon as you put it really confined like that, it ends up breaking the system because it doesn't work. So it's really just setting guidelines and basically saying, hey, here's how we like to approach things at large at our organization. And then once people know that and they get a little bit of training in it, you find that they delight and surprise you. And so they're like, oh man, like this is all I have to do and go run and show this. And, they'll take that on and they're really excited. And those also become great coaching points. And so that's kind of how we think about professional development. Once you start setting some of these things up, it really becomes easy. You don't want to spend a lot of time figuring out, well, what am I going to talk about today? Like you have these frameworks set up that you can instantly jump into.
Interesting. So we're like right off that, when you talk about frameworks and like systemizing things, as you continue to grow, how much of an emphasis do you put on that? Because systemizing everything, I mean, I just read a book like Extreme Ownership, where it's like, oh, you need to be super disciplined. Like, here are the frameworks because you'll be more efficient and you'll get better results of that. So how is your perception on frameworks and systemizing processes as you grow? How has that changed over time? What's the importance of it?
Yeah, I'm lucky. I'm a scientist. And so we have the scientific method in science, and I essentially apply that to business. And so I have a tried and true approach to my life. Like, I identify myself as a scientist. Like, when I wake up in the morning, how I think about the world, how I judge and evaluate opportunities. And that's personal, professional. It's just who I am. And so for me, it's just been a natural thing. The hardest part has been teaching that. And so it comes very, very intuitive. And I've tried to teach it a lot of different ways. What I found is teaching somebody without a science background, a scientific method, doesn't work. And so they like zone out, like, oh, God, it's science. But if you talk about design thinking really resonates. And guess what? Design thinking is the scientific method. It's just displayed a different way. And so what you find is, like, the way the business frameworks are often built are off of the scientific method, and it's just, it's named something else. So that's part of it, figuring out the naming. In terms of growing a company, there's a book called Good to Great, which is a renowned book. And it talks about the last thing you need to rocket ship off is disciplined thought. And it's oftentimes some of the hardest stuff to do, because you have so many talented people that often come from all walks of life and from different career paths and different companies that have all done it differently. And so getting people into a single frame of work, how we want to work, is really important. And so that's why I talked about work streams. That's why I talked about these different frameworks that we use, really training people on those from day one and making sure they understand this is part of our culture, and making sure that we can be consistent and reproduce what we do. Once you do that, and you do it in a way that makes them feel that they're part of it, so you're inclusive in the process, and you say, hey, there's a lot of things that we can change here. What have you seen work? What hasn't? Those are the types of things you always have to be doing to get the buy-in. But at the end of the day, people like frameworks. And so they know when if they're starting a project, and we're like, all right, we have these couple things that we're going to do every single project, that actually gives a lot of confidence to the team, because then it's kind of like stamping out something new, but something old and familiar at the same time, right? So taking on something new, they know how to approach the problem, and they know how to approach that because we've essentially trained them in some way subconsciously, and then other ways like directly. And so we know that we have some consistency in how we're approaching. And then when we start doing, planning on our side in terms of, all right, so when's this going to be done? We are much more confident in terms of the reliability and the precision in that evaluation.
Yeah, and that is the importance of frameworks, is like being, it's going to be much more reliable and it's much more precise. I am curious, is there like one particular framework that you find yourself using on a daily basis where it's like, I always come back to this framework? Is there one that comes to mind? It's a very broad, worldly question, but is there just one that comes to mind that really sticks with you?
Well, I mean, the scientific method is like my underlying framework that, I applied to everything else. But I think, PMO stuff, project management, a lot of the best practices in that should be applied to everyday work, right? And so you don't need to take on a massive project to do project management. So, as an example, project management done well usually starts with a project charter. Project charter is just outlining, what am I trying to do and why? And it's got a couple different specific things that we have to identify. It's like, what are the goals? How are we going to measure it? How do we know we're successful or not? What will we do if we run into these certain things? But you can anytime you're given a task, and this task is going to take you more than, an hour or a week, you can kind of run through that mental model of what a charter is. You can say, why am I doing this? How do I know I'm going to be successful on it? And then also, how do I know if I'm a little bit off? And so how do I know when I need to raise my hand for help, or maybe come back and say, hey, I actually don't think this is the right thing to do. And so, like, a lot of the project management approaches that are out there, some of the best practices, I think should be more universally applied in business.
Interesting. And we are coming down to a conclusion here. I just have two more questions for you. The first one would be, what books? Let's give two books that you would recommend anyone in their young 20s, or anyone that's, wants to do something entrepreneurial. Like, what are those two books that they should read? They're obviously very well read.
Go back to my 20s. Yeah, I am well read. I've named like 5 books already.
Yeah.
I would read one book to inspire. And so a life story of somebody. And so I've read a bunch of great books that do this. Mountains Beyond Mountains is a great book that I read a long time ago. It's by Tracy Kidder. And so
Okay.
this book is really about the founding of Partners in Health. Dr. Paul Farmer was somebody who dedicated his life to really helping build healthcare systems from scratch in places that didn't have any. And so while
That's
he was a student, he was flying to Haiti, and he basically built out healthcare for Haiti, which is one of the poorest countries on the planet. And reading his story, someone who went to Harvard and, was highly esteemed in his career the entire way, he just was somebody who was completely intrinsically motivated and was entirely selfless. And so that book inspired me and continues to inspire me. And Dr. Paul Farmer unfortunately passed about a year ago, but is somebody who certainly I modeled from as I read that book. Another one is by Nelson Mandela. There's another great book on The Long Walk to Freedom. So reading a book to inspire, I think, is really important. And then I always actually, when it comes to business, I always say start with negotiation books. And so I think negotiation books are really important. And so one is Negotiation Genius. I love that book. Really gives a foundational understanding of how to negotiate what you're trying to do, recognizing that, hey, it's not usually us versus them. It's really how do we do this together? And you're trying to demonstrate the bigger value. I think negotiating is one of those skills that you've got to have early, and you got to really continue to get better at, no matter what your job is, because you're always negotiating. You're always looking for your best opportunity, because life is short, and so you've got to be your own advocate as you go through life.
Interesting. I love that. The Mountains Beyond Mountains one sounds incredible. Like that sounds stupid good. So that will be on my reading list. And then last question for you. Thank you so much for joining us. Where can people find you? Where can people connect with you? You're awesome to have on. If anyone has a question about frameworks, books, anything, they will know where to find you.
Thanks. I'm not out there on a regular basis trying to start a consulting business or anything like that. I have a 1-year-old, a 4-year-old, and a company, so I stay pretty busy. So I'm not across, media self-promoting by any means, but you can connect with me on LinkedIn. That's the easiest place. A good professional network. On the other networks, I'm mostly a consumer. I just read. I don't really post. So.
Sure. Perfect. And everyone, the LinkedIn link will be down below, and definitely check out the website. That link will be down below as well. Jamie, thank you so much for joining us. This was a really fun episode, a lot of takeaways, a lot of frameworks. So yeah, thank you so much for joining us. It was an awesome episode.
I'm glad to share my perspective, Ryan. Thank you.
Hey, everybody. Thank you so much for tuning into today's episode with Jamie Fitch of OnlineMed. His expertise in the science, framework, and leadership was awesome. And if you love what we're doing, make sure to like this video, subscribe, and turn on that notification bell for all of our upcoming episodes. We have a ton of content planned, and we don't want you to miss out on any of it. If you really love what we're doing, make sure to give it a 5-star rating wherever you get your podcast. It really does help. It really does mean a lot. So thank you so much for tuning in today's episode. We'll see you on the next one.